Welcome, everybody. I'm Elisa Wood of Energy Changemakers. We're a platform that provides content and community for those working on the grid edge. And I welcome you all to today's live stream, which is titled Creating Unified Grid Pricing for Distributed Energy Resources. This is a presentation by Bruce Nordman. Many of you know Bruce, well-known and respected figure in green energy circles. He's been with Lawrence Berkeley Lab for over 3 decades, working on networks and local power distribution and other topics of great interest to this group. So this discussion is part of Energy Changemakers Energy Democracy Project. And it's a follow-up to a July talk that Lorenzo Christoph presented on his concept of bottom-up energy planning, as well as a podcast interview we did more recently with Lorenzo, Kay Aiken, and Mark Patterson. That was titled, Are We Expecting Too Much from Virtual Power Plants? So if anybody hasn't listened to that and would like to, you can find it on our website, energychangemakers.com, or on Apple Podcasts. So the gist of our discussions have centered around how to give consumers more opportunity, more of a share in the energy benefits or wealth that come from distributed energy. Basically by having pricing more closely following the physics of energy. So Bruce has an idea about how to do that, and through a new pricing structure that he wants to discuss today. I've had a chance to talk to him a little bit about it and see his slides, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. So I am going to let Bruce take it from here. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you. So I will start off here, and to tie this back to the last 2 presentations. Are we expecting too much from VPPs? Yes. And for Lorenzo, the bottom to work from is the customer, which is a reasonable starting point. But for me, the bottom to work from is an individual wire. So I take a very intra-building perspective. I'm a buildings person. I'm not a grid person. Here we are. So my focus is on a customer-centric view of the world, which I think aligns with Lorenzo's also, because I think that needs to be the central point of organization for the grid with respect to customers. And we need to design the grid around customers as if the grid was designed to serve customers. I think a lot of grid people think it's the other way around. We need something that I'm just, for purposes of convenience, calling a unified theory here, for what I call grid coordination, which is the fundamental mechanism or mechanisms between the grid and the customer. And there's a 5-page paper that I wrote a few months ago. I'd be happy to send to you that this is sort of derived from. But this really all reflects thinking I've done over the last 15 and really 20 years about this topic area, about the intersection of internet technology and electricity systems. So part of my case is that we need to have a foundational technology on which everything else is organized. And I would argue that we don't currently have that. We should really look to the success of internet architecture, which has transformed our communication systems over the last 50 years and really revolutionized them, and critically made them much better than they used to be. And that's the key is we don't want to make electricity technologies a little bit better. We need to make it much better. And the only way to really do that is to make things simple and universal so that the technologies work everywhere, which is the case with internet technology. You go to any continent, any country, even if you're in the middle of nowhere and you're not connected to the wider internet, you can still use internet technology. And then there's this term highly dynamic pricing, which I believe needs to be at the center of all this. And this is not real-time pricing, because real-time pricing is a wholesale market construct, and we're talking about retail prices. And that's always important to remind people that the 2 domains are very different and can and need to be very different. And the last thing is we typically don't address capacity except very indirectly, and we need to just address capacity very directly in order to move forward. So I have a BA and an MA, so I'm not highly literate in physics, but the unified field theory was a way to bring these sort of disparate areas of scientific inquiry into one model, a relatively simple model with just 4 elements by which everything could be organized around. And that's been a great help to physics. I work at a physics lab, and so that's really been a central thing. We need something like that for electricity. There was the concept of an energy services interface, and I actually worked myself on several projects on that. but I would say that that never really led to any clear progress. It led to a little progress, but nothing really very fundamental. So a related concept from biology is this notion of punctuated equilibria, where you have in species or in ecosystems long periods where things are relatively stable, and then some sort of disruption happens. You have a very quick, in geologic time or biologic time, change, and then you enter another period of stability. And I would say that we did that with communications, where we had the phone system, which worked well for about a century. And then over the past few decades, we've replaced it with something much better, internet technology. And of course, those transitions, can span decades, and they can be expensive. But ultimately, you get to a much better place, so it's worth it. And of course, there's also Thomas Kuhn's work on sort of how we move to beyond just incremental changes. So to sort of spoil the lead, my argument here is that we can really decompose this problem into three mostly separable problems of energy, power, and capacity. So energy, it's what meters measure and what our bills are mostly based out. And so you have in intervals of time with a price. And ideally, that's all we need for energy. And then power, that's the things that inverters do, power quality and such. And it's sort of its own domain. And then capacity, again, it's I colloquially call it the size of the pipe. It's making sure that we do not overload cables or equipment because that's going to damage things or cause safety problems if we do. So we always need to do that. And typically we only do that today through massive oversizing and static worst case assumptions, which is not workable for the future. So if you have, I love Swiss Army knives. I've got one right here. And if you don't have a toolbox, they're a great thing to do. So that if that's all you have, you can open a bottle of wine, you can cut a piece of paper, you can saw a piece of wood, you can cut an orange and get the rind off. But if you want to do something, you're much better off with a single purpose tool for the same job. Putting in a Phillips screwdriver is much easier with a Phillips screwdriver. A Phillips screw with a screwdriver than it is with a Swiss Army knife. So we really want to have simple systems for simple problems. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer. I don't work on the power topic. I think that the people who do seem to have it pretty well in hand, and so I'm happy to have that and not try to draw any conclusions about it. But I wouldn't want them to draw conclusions about domains that they don't work on either. So our grid, I call it the unitary grid. It's one big system. In my case, for California, we're part of the Western grid of about 70 million people. It's all synchronous. So it's sort of like a big single lake of power that power plants are, putting into and buildings are taking out of. That's not quite true, but it's to a first order, a good way of thinking about it. Very much like the phone system used to be one big system. And while that can make things very reliable and scalable, it has extreme limitations. So that's the current model that we've been working with. And we've been working with it so long, people think that that's the only possible model. Now, over the past 150 years now, since the grid was invented, the ways that we make electricity have changed dramatically. The ways that we use have changed dramatically. But the ways that we move electricity around, both the physical components and also the controls, have hardly changed. We have gone from fuses to circuit breakers, but and there's innovations around the edge, but in terms of the fundamentals of the system, the fundamental systems are really not that different from how they used to be many generations ago. So there's a lot of characteristics that the unitary grid and the unitary phone system share. And they were the best thing you could do with the technology available at the time. That's a critical thing, is that these systems are driven by what you can do with technology. And they all these characteristics. And of course, in order to create internet technology, we didn't modify the phone system to create internet technology. We had to throw away a whole lot of the assumptions about how it worked and replace it with something better. And so as we think about our unitary utility grid, I think there's naturally something which would be a network model of power, which is what I've been trying to explore. And that manifests itself both in the grid and actually even more importantly, inside the buildings, and also then between the building and the grid. And that's the way of thinking we have to take. So, how did we get to the wonderful communications technology that we have today, which of course we're now using with Zoom here and Wi-Fi? The incumbents were useless. Multiple people went to Bell Labs in the 1950s and said, "Hey, there's this new thing called packet switching. We think it's the future of communications." And what did the smart engineers at Bell Labs do? They said, "Oh yeah, we're aware of that. We know it cannot possibly work, therefore we don't need to study it." And so other people created internet technology, and the phone system was surprised. They created ISDN lines, which were great at what they do, but are not network connections, and so that's not what people wanted. That wasn't the future. The incumbents are sort of basically incapable of inventing the future because they're so embedded in past systems. And a critical thing this is a question of deterministic versus non-deterministic systems. Now, our wholesale markets are relatively deterministic, but loads have always been almost completely non-deterministic. But a lot of people assume that the only way to make the system better is to make the loads deterministic, which is actually exactly the wrong approach. Internet technology is completely non-deterministic, and that's what allows it to work and be cost-effective and scale. So you really have to start from scratch. You need to start from the fundamentals, and that's why I started with individual wires inside the buildings, and then got to devices, and then built up larger systems from that. I didn't start from our existing grid and try to tweak it, like taking an old horse-drawn carriage and try to tweak it into a car. You can do that, but it's not going to be nearly as good as a car designed around an internal combustion engine or a car designed around an electric drive. And so originally, internet communication was sent over phone lines, and then eventually phone calls were sent over internet connections. And we can expect that kind of sort of transition over many decades from where we are now to a much better system. And the key is that if you do it right, the fundamentals are basically intact. If you look at the definition of the internet protocol from decades ago, we still use IPv4. The document isn't that long, and most of the complexities and features that are rarely or never used. So it's really been an astounding technology success. And critically, you have to have storage in order to create a network model. And of course, we didn't have storage of data back in the 1880s or storage of electricity. And then we've, since invented both in the ways that are cost-effectively used, and that's what really can drive this. So if you look at these two domains, basically, internet technology and future electricity technology are really wanting to do the same thing. You're moving a resource from one place to another place. You're moving it over space or through storage over time, from where it's more available to where it's less available. And of course, resource availability in general, we measure through prices. But there's this fundamental difference in that every packet of data has a source, a destination, and content. So they're all different. And that's why you have to route them from one unique place to another unique place. Electrons, it turns out, my physics colleagues assure me that they are all the same. And so doing a literal routing of electricity would make no sense. And so we need a different fundamental mechanism than the mechanism of the internet, but we still need a fundamental mechanism. So again, with communications, it's the internet protocol, and my assertion is that for energy, it's price and quantity. Plus, we do need to always manage capacity constraints. So my argument, and I've been, this has been centered on my thinking for the last 15 years, is that there's actually no other mechanism other than pricing can have the capability to work in any context, any scale, any country, any building type, and whether or not you're grid connected, and truly be universal. In fact, with pricing, we use pricing in wholesale markets, and with Ethernet, you can put a price on an individual Ethernet cable, which can take up to 90 watts, and that's literally 9 orders of magnitude difference in scale where you can use the same mechanism. Which is pretty astounding. There's not that many things that span 9 orders of magnitude. But the internet protocol is also one of them. So critically, an essential part of this, which we forget to do, is to throw things away. Things that are obsolete, we should be throwing away. well, the Electoral College is an example of things that have really outlived their usefulness. Now, when I was a child, I had crayons, and one of the crayons in my box was called Flesh, and it was this sickly pink color, which didn't match the skin color of anybody who I went to school with, and it was really wrong for some of the people. And we don't do that anymore. We don't have a quote unquote flesh color in crayon box anymore because it's an idea whose time is long past. And there's a whole lot of things about our electricity system that we use today whose time is long past, and we need to get rid of them if we're going to make progress. And I've listed some of these things here. And part of this is the actual technology, and part of this is how people think about these things. We're just thinking about things in a way that impedes having a better future. And critically, some of this goes into our principles of regulations and tariff, like the idea that we should set retail prices based on some narrow determination of cost. That's an obsolete idea. Demand charges. I've been over the past year and a half asking people when they think demand charges were invented, and some people say the 90s, some people the 70s, some people the 40s. It turns out it's 1897. It's literally a 19th century technology whose time is long past. It long should have been thrown away. And I've concluded that I'm opposed to demand response programs, which may sound weird for somebody whose focus is demand response. But if you have tariffs, then you don't need a program to cover up the fact that your tariff is bad. In other words, programs are only, for this kind of purpose, a symptom of a bad tariff underlying it. They're a Band-Aid. Cure the underlying wound, and you don't need the Band-Aid. So, of course, using pricing is not new. Time of use was proposed in the 19th century. So lots and lots of people have proposed and done work on pricing long before I showed up on the scene. So I'm not claiming to have any originality here. But a key thing is that with prices that are at least hourly, it has to be automated. And we now have cost-effective and standardized technology so that we can automate price response by devices. I actually own two grid responsive devices today. My heat pump controller operates according to hourly prices, which sadly I can't pay, so they're fictitious prices. But it works. And I'm having the company that runs my heat pump controller send it prices, and inside the box of the controller in my closet, it's using them. And then a year ago, my phone got a free software update, so it optimizes to a marginal greenhouse gas signal. And probably most of you on this call have that too. If that was a price signal instead of a GHG signal, it would be price responsive today for free with only just a software update, no cost. So what do prices look like? These are some actual 10-year-old highly dynamic prices from Illinois. This is only the wholesale part of it. It doesn't include the distribution adder, so it's not the complete retail price. And there's now, I haven't counted it, but on the order of almost 20 countries around the world, and probably more, that have such prices available today. This is not some proposal for what we could do in theory. This is what people are doing in practice. And oddly, manufacturers and adding features to products that their customers cannot use. You really need to offer the prices, and then customers, manufacturers of products will take it seriously. So what do I mean by this term highly dynamic price? Again, this is a retail price. It's not a wholesale price. So I think it's inappropriate to use the term RTP. Also, you should not calculate the retail price directly from the wholesale price. That's the wrong answer. Now, if you did that, that would be much less wrong than what we do today. So doing that would be a reasonable step on the way to a better way of setting prices. But we have to understand where we actually want to go to. So, it makes no sense to go to intervals less than hourly. My smart meter only goes to 15 minutes. So with my meter, I could only get 15-minute pricing. With one exception, nobody over the past 5 years that I've talked to has thought we need prices faster than 5 minutes. But we may well get a half hour and 15 minutes and decide that there's so much storage on the grid that we don't need to go to finer time grains. That's an implementation detail that really shouldn't matter. You set it no further in advance than the day before and be different every day because you need to be responsive to actual grid conditions. If you're not responsive to actual grid conditions, it's the wrong price. You will get the wrong result. So in terms of what needs to be communicated, which is my job, communicating things, you need to have the electricity prices for a day ahead so that devices can plan for their operation to shift load. And it doesn't matter whether the price is a guaranteed price set the day in advance or whether day in advance you just get a forecast like the weather forecast, as long as it's good enough to plan for. So the weather forecast isn't exact, but it's good enough to decide whether or not to take an umbrella. So it's good enough for planning purposes. You also, in California, we're planning on sending out marginal greenhouse emissions so that people can optionally use that for decision making and very occasional emergency alerts. The last two of these are non-financial. So how does this all work? This is my architecture diagram, which I have changed 0 times since it. So prices flow from a central price server set by the retailer out to the various points where one of the 4 entities at the bottom of the screen does the translation from price to functional control. We'll make good use of all 4 of those. So we need to make sure we enable with the technology all 4 of those. And critically, a third party is a cloud-based entity, but it's not an aggregator because it doesn't have a financial relationship with the grid. It's operating for the benefit of the customer. It's not operating for the benefit of the grid. Now, if the grid charges good prices, the result will be beneficial for the grid also. So you get a lot of benefits from using prices. And critically, the customer gets all of the value of their flexibility. If you have a virtual power plant model, the VPP operator will take most of the money, and that's going to take away tons of money from customers investing in decarbonization and flexibility. And in order to be cost effective, we need to make the cost as low as possible. So the last topic here is capacity management, which again, we typically don't do today. We just overbuild things. If we operated freeways and we operate the grid, we would only give out driver's licenses so that 0 hours of the year we would have a traffic jam on the freeway. Now, if we did that, our freeways would be mostly empty. That's not a reasonable way to operate, but that's how we operate the distribution system. But as we electrify, we don't have the supply chains or money to dramatically overbuild the distribution system that way. And the constraints can apply to a feeder, a transformer, a wire. Capacity constraints exist all over the system. And the things that pricing generally operates at the scale of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or maybe even 1 million people. Whereas these capacity constraints could be an individual transformer with 10 customers. So they're operating at different scales. And so things can average out with pricing in a way that they can't do for capacity, which means that we need to have a separate mechanism. So Australia already has faced this issue with excess PV, where an increasing number of customers were being told they were not allowed to install PV because the feeder would be overloaded a few hours of the year because they were, just like we are, working on static worst case scenarios. So what did they do? They are deploying limit-based capacity management, where for customers with PV, every day the customer gets a limit for how much they can export to the grid. So the grid can be assured that the combined total won't overload the system. And if you are in danger of curtailing to stay under your export limit, you can just shift load, which is what we want people to do anyways. And so what this means, you can use a lot more of the distribution system capacity you can have, and more people can add PV. So now that's for PV, which are all synchronized because every building faces the same sun on a feeder. But with EV charging, it's all random in terms of when people might want to charge and such. It's not synchronized the way that PV is, so it requires a different solution. But so to give you some context for capacity. On average, my house uses no electricity because my PV annually uh, covers that. But let's ignore that. On average, it uses about a kilowatt for a fully electric house, albeit with no electric vehicles. My peak hour last year was a little over 4 kilowatts. A level 2 charger is over 7 kilowatts. So the charger by itself could use almost twice my peak and over 7 times my typical. So it's an enormously bursty load. And actually, a year ago, I replaced the main electrical panel per house, and PG&E told me I was not allowed to install an EV charger for this issue. So I know this is a live issue, and it will be getting more so. And so we absolutely need to manage capacity because we can't spend the money we don't have to overbuild the transmission system. So what I think we need is what I would call permission-based capacity management. And this leverages a concept that's been used in USB for 32 years in products that we all own. So it's not a new idea or it's not a sophisticated idea. So you would have a subscription to some amount of capacity that you could always use, and you would just do that annually. And then for the load or loads which could cause you to go over that, initially just just EVs, maybe stationary batteries also. You need to have the ability to modulate them to stay under that limit. And then if you want to use more, you could put in a reservation request to have more capacity from the grid and ask the grid for permission for that. So what could the grid do? It could say, okay, there's plenty of capacity on your feeder, go for it. You got the reservation. It could say, well, there is capacity, but this is kind of a peak time, so we want to charge a fee to encourage people to spread out their capacity requests. So, and then I could either decide to charge later, or I could put in the fee. Or if it would damage equipment for me to use more capacity, it would say no because it would damage equipment. So OpenADR3 has the capabilities for this. So this is a graphic representation of this. Here's your subscription level. If you wanted to stay within that, you can always charge, but you're charging more slowly than you would perhaps like to do if you could charge as fast as possible. Maybe you do a subscription so you can charge more quickly, or if you had a higher subscription, you could fully use, the charger at full capacity and charge in the shortest time. So it allows for some negotiation so that to optimize between the customer and the grid for allocation of this scarce resource for capacity. So in summary, one mechanism at all scales. We can use the same mechanism pricing from a wholesale market down to an individual wire. We need to focus on making much better retail markets, which have been broken for over a century because we charge terrible prices. And I thought that was just the Soviet Union that charged terrible prices, but we still do here. We need to create really rich infrastructure inside of buildings, which is kind of a separate topic from this building to grid discussion. And again, we can use pricing down to individual wires so that we can use simple and universal technology so that everybody, including the most poor people, can have better technology. So thank you. Let's see, Elisa, do you want to call on people or people just chime in or?
Yeah, if people could raise their hand. There's so many of us on the call. I thought it might be a good idea. We usually chime in, but it seems like this is a pretty big group today. So who's got questions? Please raise your hand and I will unmute you.
I see a hand.
Yep.
iPad man. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Hang on, I'm just going to unmute all.
Sounded like Christopher.
Okay. Bruce, I was the person I think you recognized first. Bruce, that's a great presentation. This is Louis Rasky, who used to be a colleague of yours across the hall a long time ago when I worked at Home Energy. It's a great presentation. On the surface, it sounds really good, and I'm absorbing it all in. I guess what I wonder is, in theory, this should not impact the need, and I know you're just dealing on universal pricing, but obviously we in the general community are constantly told that our pricing is impacted by the need of greater capacity to improve the grid, choose whatever, you know, policy point you want. Would would this also be able to make some of that clear, or don't you have to, in doing something like this, throw away the whole almost public utility model that exists now too? And again, I realize you're dealing just with the pricing, not with policy of the public utilities.
Yeah. So I think of the world in sort of having three domains. There's the grid domain, which I do not work on. What goes on inside the grid with different grid actors and wholesale and such and retailers. All I care is that there's some retailer that is setting a price that is charged to customers. I don't care who it is, how the price is set. That's all a black box to me. Then there's this customer to grid interface where we need to have prices and capacity management. And that needs to be universal. And the technology inside of buildings needs to be universal. How grids work internally can be different from place to place, because if you're a power plant, you only interact with one grid. But if you're a heat pump water heater, you may land on any continent and need to work in whatever building you land in. So we need to have universal technologies like we do with IT. Does that answer the question?
Well, no, I understand that completely, and it makes, that makes incredible sense. So I guess I am asking you something away from your question, like the overall acceptance, because in theory, it seems like this would be a really good solution. But I guess I'm drawn to how would you implement it?
You can just start charging prices like they are doing in some other countries, and like we're planning to do in California in 2027. The only way to move into the future is to start moving into the future. And the biggest barrier is the lack of good prices that customers can then use.
All right. Can you explain then real briefly, and I understand some of what was supposed to be set for 2027 and then it changed. Can you just explain that briefly, and then I'll shut up?
Well, California has, from our Energy Commission and PUC, policies to require the utilities to offer hourly prices. I know the PUC hasn't finalized what they want to require, and they're considering things like subscriptions, which I honestly think are a complete waste of time and add complexity with no benefit. So I don't honestly know exactly what they're going to do. But the point is, we need to start having good prices so that customers and customer devices can use them. And until then, we're kind of stuck in the mud. We can't do really much of anything. We just spend money on Band-Aids that are expensive and not that good. We just need to start moving in the future. Why don't we move on to someone else? I think there's a lot of people with hands up.
Okay, we've got some more people with their hands raised here.
Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, Myron, would you like to go next?
Yes, so I may. I understand that Bruce said that he doesn't mind real-time pricing, but he thinks there's something better. I wanted to know what that something better is. And the other thing is, because I didn't perceive it in his talk exactly what that something better was. And the other thing that I thought was real important, I don't know if Bruce mentioned this, but that the total payback for someone who's trying to put in a heat pump, water heater, or a very efficient air conditioner, they have to know the prices are going to be there sufficiently so they can finance the improvement. And I don't see how that's weaved into what you've said. So I have two questions. Those are two questions.
Yeah. So the explanation of why calculating a retail price directly from a wholesale energy price is not the right answer. It requires more time than we have right here, but it gets to the fact that customers are not power plants. They behave in ways that are different than the way power plants behave because they're delivering services to people and people have their own patterns and such. But again, if we start using the wholesale prices, we'll be much better off than we are today. Maybe we'll get 80% of the way there, but we won't get 100% of the way there. So we have time to figure that out. And as a person who's a buildings person and concerned with the technology inside the buildings, being the building grid, that's a sort of a separable problem for how you calculate the best price. That's up to other people to do. And there's plenty of smart people who can work on that, and we'll use machine learning to learn from the past as to how to best set tomorrow's prices. And then as far as the price certainty, I mean, that is a good point that if you don't have certainty, you won't know exactly how much you'll save. But if you have confidence that there's going to be enough dynamic range in the prices where on enough days you can get enough benefit of shifting load that it's probably going to be worth it, then you can sort of budget in enough sort of savings from that. But it's not a guarantee. Nothing, there's so many things in life that are not guaranteed. You won't know exactly how much you're going to save.
Let me just say, I do a lot of building energy performance recommendations, and people want to know they will get their money back in 5 years or some similar number. Do you have any reason to believe that your system will solve that problem?
No, I don't think it'll solve the problem. I don't think it'll necessarily make it that much worse because the savings you get from flexibility add to your other savings. And we don't have, certainty on what retail prices are going to do. So even for efficiency, we don't have certainty for that. But we can just have enough confidence to be able to make a decision. And I think this can provide that. I think that's a separable question from what the technology and system architecture should be.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
So I think Jim is next.
Jim's next.
Thanks. Great presentation, Bruce. Thanks a lot. I'm interested in your opinion on how much the addition of storage on the distribution network, whether it's on the customer side of the meter in EVs or on the utility side of the meter, but how much the addition of distribution of storage on the distribution system changes the nature of the relevant pricing. I like to think that eventually electricity will become like toilet paper, where there's warehouses full of it, and this supermarket has a bunch of it on the shelf, and the warehouse has a bunch of it. I've got a 12-pack, and I'm not too worried about dynamic pricing because it's a storable commodity.
Yeah. So at one point on the planet, there was no digital data storage, and now, of course, where do we find storage? We find storage everywhere. I mean, we all have lots of devices in our buildings that have some amount of data storage. Now, on the internet, there is some storage in the middle of the network in switches and routers, but the vast majority of the storage is at the edge of the network because that's where it's more useful to be. And for electricity storage, I mean, electricity storage is extremely useful, but there's always a capital cost and there's an operational loss in using it. So it's not free to use it, but it's really useful. And also you have the AC/DC conversion losses. So the best places to put storage are either next to generation or next to or internal to end use because it gives you the most reliability. If it's in the building, then the grid goes down, you can operate as a microgrid. And also if it's inside a device, most devices are DC internally. So if you can avoid some extra AC/DC conversions if the storage is inside the device. So the least useful place to put the storage again is in the middle of the grid. That is not in a power plant or in a customer site. Now we will undoubtedly have some, and that's fine. We want to have some, but we want to have most of it be at the edges of the network. Yeah.
Lisa, can I build off of that? Add to Jim's. So Jim, the differences between what Bruce is talking about is like technology. We've gotten from an era where we had no storage anywhere in the system to everybody having RAM storage and hard drive storage in their devices. Is the pace of infrastructure change in the utility system is amazingly much slower than the technology world. So we have to balance infrastructure improvement, and when we're talking, NREL's talking 81% increase in throughput. So overall throughput, we will have to use every single possible chance to deliver electrons over our existing grid, because right now our grid is utilized about 45%. So that's, and then we're going to have 2 to 3 times peaks. So we're going to have to completely level the load curve. And that's where, as you talked about, storage on the distribution grid will help. But I don't imagine that it's going to do all of it based upon the analysis work I've done, the modeling work I've done.
Yeah, luckily we don't need to decide now what the balance of generation, site storage, transmission associated, distribution associated, or inside the customer site. We need to make sure we enable all of them, and then let pricing, ideally, help determine how much we have in each place and how we use it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I agree.
But I think Barry was going to jump in next. Barry?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple things. First, a real quick comment on where the storage is located. Pricing can manage balancing that. The problem is if the storage is located at the generation site, the transmission costs go through the roof. But I've just kind of a different perspective probably than a lot of people on this, and I'm really honored to be part of this group. I'm just a regular installer of customer energy resources, or CERs. We install solar, storage, heat pumps in Silicon Valley, and they let me out of my cage sometimes to lobby the government. And what I've learned is really 2 big issues. How do we regulate the out of control utility infrastructure spending? Because they're trying to maximize their profits. And that's just built into the utility business model. And if we're not able to control that, then the costs are going to go up and the rates are going to go up. Doesn't matter how you slice it or who pays for it. I think ultimately we'll all pay for it indirectly through taxes if we don't do something. And the second thing, which really is becoming apparent to me from working on VPPs really hands-on in California for the last 8 years, is how do we overcome the utility constraints on competitive technologies? They just seem to always throw a lot of sand in the gears to make these things not work, so that they can say, hey, we tried VPPs, but we really need to put storage at the generation point. And then we find out that the transmission costs go through the roof. So both of these are really policy issues. They're not technology issues. And Bruce, as you pointed out, they were really faced by the telecoms industry, and ultimately these problems were overcome not with more technology, but with antitrust regulations. So I'm 100% in favor of all the things that we're talking about here, but unless we can change that utility business model, the total costs are going to be high, and no matter how we slice it, people are going to have high bills.
Performance-based regulation. Sorry.
Yeah. So first off, I'm thrilled that you used the customer energy resource term. I think that's what we all need to start using. I first heard that in Australia called a consumer energy resource, but I prefer what you said, customer energy resource. I think the DER term is problematic in a variety of ways because it's ambiguous as to whether it's a customer device or a grid device. And a lot of people assume we're only talking about inverters with that term. So I think we need to, just like we're moving from demand response to demand flexibility, we need to move from DER to CER.
And it's important because customers own it, they pay for it. And this is something that Ahmed and I have been talking about. So thanks.
Yeah, and a lot of grid people forget that it's the customer's device, and that's why switching that terminology is helpful. On the policy and regulatory aspects, that's sort of outside of my domain. I completely agree that those are tremendously important and huge barriers that need to be worked on. But I don't have the background or expertise or Rolodex to really know what to do, except for until we start offering better prices, we're just screwing over customers, because that's that primary point of contact. What's the price that they're selling things at? And they're sort of holding us hostage to 19th century technology with crappy prices.
Let me just jump in here with a question from the comments. Which utilities are ready to roll this out? Have any pilots been done? What are the results?
Yeah, I mean, I think and a lot of people have said this, that we overdo pilots, thinking that we don't know how to move into the future. I mean, I would think that charging better prices should not be that controversial in our, capitalistic society, and that adhering to bad prices seems like, I don't know why that's so controversial. And again, I had that list of almost 20 countries where they are already doing this today. And, in Illinois, we have a few tens of thousands of people who have been paying these prices for over 10 years, I think, with very little automation. And we just need to start moving into the future. That's the primary thing we need to do. What was I think I missed part of the question.
It was what are the results?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So in Scandinavia, and part of this was as a result of the war in Ukraine, wholesale prices went through the roof. They found that just charging hourly prices was the most reasonable thing to do. And they started doing it, and it resulted in bills that were lower than bills on the fixed tariffs. And so most people switched, and it works. It's not rocket science. We've got the smart meters. We just need to move into the future. I think there's a lot of fears about pricing that are horribly overblown and not based on data. And there's plenty of good things you can do, like you could calculate people's bills with the dynamic price and with some sort of TOU price. And if they would have paid less with a TOU, you can charge them that. And then over time, you can just ratchet up the difference between the two to make sure that the highly dynamic price is more economically attractive to everyone.
My daughter in Norway doesn't even notice that she lives on dynamic pricing. Doesn't even notice.
Because switching to different pricing does not raise system costs. All it can do is help lower system costs. It's a way to save money. It's not a way to raise average bills.
And the Ameren work in Illinois proves that, where 98% of people saw a reduction in their bill.
Oh.
Yeah, and the 2% of people whose bills went up are underpaying today. I mean, I'm under net metering. I'm getting hugely subsidized for my solar panels, and it's really bad because other people have to pay for it. Because my first year electricity bill for less than $10,000 of investment was minus $82 for a fully electric house, and that can't possibly make sense. So
I want to. Lorenzo wants to say. So Lorenzo, his discussion in July was a precursor, and also on the podcast was a precursor to this discussion. So Lorenzo, I see you have your hand raised.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Bruce, really enjoyed your presentation. And you did make a point at the beginning that you and I agree on a number of things, which is true. But I also want to highlight a couple of things that we may not agree on, just for added color and clarification. And where I would start with is I feel like we need a community-centric view of energy transition, not just a consumer-centric view or a customer-centric view. I agree serving end uses of energy is the primary driver of everything. But when it comes to planning supply infrastructure, it can be anywhere. And it really makes sense to plan it at a community level with shared resources that can be used to serve the neighborhood. We have technology so that electricity supply can be a local business. And when I think about energy justice, environmental justice, I want to see these local businesses thrive, owned by local governments, community co-ops, tribes, a variety of different types of organizations that can actually earn productive assets to produce electricity to supply their neighbors and use those productive assets then to build community wealth, et cetera. Now, when it comes to your pricing model, then I think, if they use the distribution network, which invariably they will, if you build a local, say, storage plus PV plus storage hybrid, and you're supplying a whole neighborhood, well, you're using the grid to do that. So dynamic pricing for the use of the grid to me makes a lot of sense, but I would separate that out from the price of energy because that's going to be determined in different ways depending on the nature of the projects. And it may be that a community would decide that they're not going for the cheapest kilowatt hour because there are other benefits to the community from being able to locate supply locally. And so therefore, I'm thinking about a planning process that starts with what customers may put on their roofs or in their buildings, but then looks at community level supply and local businesses and local economic development and all of those benefits as the next step upward for that. And now it does require some action in the policy realm because we do need to require the distribution utilities to enable those sort of businesses to operate at reasonable costs. And we do need to make it legal for a business to sell power over the utilities wires, essentially something they call retail wheeling, I think is the
right, exactly. So really, that's the term.
Yeah, and to make that legal, I think it's all technologically feasible. So one more point that I would add is on this use of the term CER, customer energy resources. I think that's fine, and I think it's a good term, but I also want to preserve a distinction between front-of-meter resources that are connected on distribution versus ones that are connected on transmission. And if we're planning energy at community level, I suspect most of those supply resources are going to be distribution connected. And if they're offset by load in that same local distribution area, then they don't impact a need for transmission, and they can be entirely transactions that are inside distribution and don't go through the wholesale power markets or the transmission system. If we can create that paradigm, that I think improves the economics fantastically for a community-based energy transition.
Yeah, no, excellent points. So I would say that my domains of what I claim to be expertise or knowledge is inside the customer site and between the customer and the grid. And what I think you've gotten to is what happens inside the grid, but highlighting the distinction between the macro grid and the local distribution grid, which is really outside of my domain of work. I think that what I proposed is quite compatible with what you have. I think there's a few open questions, like I'm not convinced that peer-to-peer electricity exchange has value, but I think that's.
No, I'm not either. I'm not arguing for peer-to-peer.
Okay, great. Yeah. So,
but I do think where the intersection is, dynamic pricing for use of the distribution grid is a way of creating a fair return for whoever is the operator and the owner of those assets. And we do need to address that, but it's separate from the cost of the energy.
Yeah. So, I mean, what it sounds like, I think what you're getting at is essentially something like a wholesale market that's within that community, which is sort of connected to, but decoupled from the wide area whole scale market of regions. And I think that's a perfectly valid and probably useful thing to go in. And we just need to make sure that the intra building and building the customer technology is compatible with your system and vice versa, and sort of co-design those. So I would welcome sort of some more conversations on how to do that.
Lorenzo, you're talking about a dynamic distribution fee only. Why would you not want to include a dynamic energy cost or dynamic transmission cost?
Well, because Well, if you're using the transmission grid, that could be part of the bundle. It's the delivery charge. It's the use of the system. However, there will be some transactions that don't use the transmission system, and we need to allow for those if they're entirely within distribution. Now, as far as energy charge, that's going to depend on the local business. Who is the supplier? And I don't think that should be centrally determined. There's a price if you buy energy from the ISO, okay. There's a price if you buy energy from the investor-owned utility. But if there's a local business that's supplying energy, it's up to them to figure out their pricing.
Yes, so it'd be cheaper for me to buy from you, from the community, than it would be to buy from the transmission system, because I wouldn't have to pay the dynamic transmission fee.
Well, that's the objective. That's where I want to go. And I think Neil Chatterjee helped us out a little bit with a letter he wrote to the CPUC earlier this year, criticizing their proposed decision on community solar, saying that it was perfectly reasonable to have retail, sales for resale that are entirely within distribution and don't utilize the FERC jurisdiction.
May I interject? Bruce uses the word network, which means electrons can move in different directions than from top down. But I don't see where he's explaining that.
Well, so the real network model of power, comes inside of buildings, where I envision a rich mesh network of nanogrids inside building sites at different voltages, some AC and some DC. I didn't get into that to this talk for this price. And I'm assuming that we still have a functionally sort of a unitary electricity grid on the other side of the meter. But we don't have to. We could extend the model of multiple domains of power into the grid. And actually, I think what Lorenzo is describing is essentially creating a community scale microgrid that is managed sort of independently of both the customers and the larger wide area network. It is connected to them, but they're loosely coupled and they're not tightly coupled. And I think that's a great way of thinking. I have not tried to explore that because, again, I try to stay within my lane as a buildings person. Yeah. But anyways, yeah. So I think there's I think we can have this universal technology instead of buildings and still have it compatible with extending the model up to have sort of different domains within the electricity grid itself. Part of this then relates to how we fund the electricity grid. And we need to really roadify the grid. We need to treat the grid more like we treat roads, where we fund the grid through one single revenue source. We fund roads through dozens of revenue sources: federal, state, local, property tax, sales taxes, gasoline taxes, all kinds of things. We need to start funding the grid through multiple sources because it's not reasonable to do it the way we do now.
Good. Any more questions? I see Kay and Myron, you still have your hands raised. More do you want to add?
I wanted to add that. Actually, you want to talk, Kay? I'll let you go first.
No, mine was in error, a hand in error.
Okay. So I actually suggested this to Kay a week ago or so. Suppose you put a battery on the transmission system in the middle of a city. So it's definitely on the other side of the meter. And then a person could drive their car up to it and charge their car and drive back to the house and charge up their house, which is really great in a hurricane, which, by the way, we had last week, and I'm still suffering from it. But it could also work when the grid's up, because if you have a 1% share of that 6 megawatt hour battery, then you, in a sense, are not violating the rules to buy electricity from yourself. And that would create a network. But Kay pointed out that would be kind of an intermittent sense of network.
It's wonderful, but it only works in ENO right now, Byron. It does not work anywhere else in the state where you're suggesting. It breaks every FERC rule throughout the entire country, what you're suggesting.
Where did you say it works?
It works in ENO in New Orleans.
Energy New Orleans. Because the rules in Louisiana is you must buy electricity from the grid that's around you, like the rest of the country. But there are people in the regulatory group in New Orleans think that it might be possible for a person to own part of one of these batteries on the other side of the grid and access it anytime when the grid's up or not. When the grid's down, it's really useful for resilience. When the grid's up, we think it might be legal to buy.
Yeah, so of course we need to make sure that that works, but we don't want to, wires are likely to be more efficient and convenient than moving around other ways. So I think the vast majority will be over wires, but of course, whenever it's useful to do it through other means, we should facilitate that. Barry?
Yeah, this problem of where to put the storage is going away because many of us are already driving 100 kilowatt hour batteries around from work to home. And if we charge up during the day at work where energy is really cheap, we can drive that energy home without violating any FERC rules and plug the energy into our house.
That's true. That's true.
And the Ford Lightning and the Cybertruck both have those AC output capabilities that will almost completely work with many of the traditional backup interfaces.
The problem that Myron doesn't recognize is when you're doing what you're doing, Barry, is you are buying it at retail at your place of business and taking it home. What he's suggesting is you buy at the transmission price and then sell it retail in effect because you own a part of the battery. That's
Costco.
what I suggest will break FERC rules big time.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes. So I'm easy to find if anyone wants.
Bruce, I have a question.
We'll do one more question, and then I promised everybody 1:15, and we're going over. So one more question.
Bruce, you mentioned about the capacity charge, the subscription capacity charge. Is there any way that you could not have that and just use dynamic pricing instead?
The capacity is designed to make sure that we don't overload equipment, transformers and wires in the distribution system. And if you don't do it through a limit-based system of some sort, then the grid has to be always concerned that customers can use the entire capacity that they're available. My house I have a 100 amp panel, but my typical consumption is 4 amps. So there's a factor of 25 between my typical and the size of my panel and service entrance. So if everybody used all the capacity that their system has, it would blow out the distribution system. And so the utility, if it can't be guaranteed of something, it has to be extremely conservative, which is why PG&E told me I couldn't put in a level 2 charger. The only way to directly address the capacity problem is by managing the capacity problem. If you try to do it through another means, it's always going to be hugely problematic, like it is today.
Okay, but you can, in theory, have a capacity of your local pole top transformer. So
there is a capacity.
The 10 houses that it serves, it has a capacity that you could manage based on the price of that feeder.
Pricing won't work. Occasionally I'm in Lake Tahoe, and if tons of people on a ski weekend drive up with their Teslas into their expensive vacation houses, and they've got lots of money because they own a vacation house in Tahoe, all plug in their Teslas on Friday night after they get there, that's going to overload the system, and they don't care about money. Pricing is not going to work. It's not a sufficient mechanism.
Yeah, I could see that the price would
but it doesn't manage capacity.
The price would spike, and therefore there'd be more money for that transformer upgrade.
But there's only a few. I mean, this is a more detailed topic we should probably. But it's you can't do everything with pricing alone. You have to manage capacity.
Right.
So I think we're all in agreement. We have to have Bruce back. There's so much to discuss here. Thank you, Bruce. This was a tremendous presentation. Really furthered the discussion. For those of you new to Energy Changemakers, come check out our site, energychangemakers.com. We have a free newsletter, a free podcast. Please sign up. We'd love to have you. So thank you, everyone. And oh, by the way, and Bruce, do you want to talk about how people can get in touch with you?
Oh, well, yeah, I just had it up there. If you Google my name, you'll you should be able to find my email address, or I'm on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. And this will be posted on the Energy Changemakers site. So thank you.